The uncomfortable atmosphere continued even after those two left. It was thick with the idea that simply thinking about the culprit's identity would be the same as deciding whom to suspect. It had begun to feel like discussion of the case it was itself taboo. So no one mentioned the case, at least not out loud. However, those thoughts were what filled our minds. All we could think, all that we couldn't say aloud made our heads feel like they were going to explode. So, at least on the outside, the parlour had once again regained its calm mood. Everyone was left unsettled.
少しだけ雨足が弱まった気がするね。
おお、まだいっぱい降ってるよ。おお。
仮にやんだって、この島には船がねえんだしな。船が明日すぐに来てくれりゃいいんだがよ。洋館バカンさんもうお腹いっぱいだぜ。
母さん、明日船はいつ来るのかな。
本来なら帰りの船は今日の3時に来てくれることになっていました。先方も台風が過ぎてから来直すと電話をしてくれたでしょうが、あいにく電話は普通ですから。でも向こうも子供の使いではありません。客人の方々の送迎目的だと教えてありますから、おそらく明日の朝一番で、多分9時頃くらいに来てくれるでしょう。
It was completely black outside. When I looked at the clock, I realized it was just past 7. I was starting to get hungry. In the kitchen, Kumasawa was cooking enthusiastically. She had laid out a variety of dishes, and while they didn't match the level of Godo's artful cooking, they were still quite gorgeous. It was an act of kindness from Kumasawa, who was trying to enliven everyone's low spirits with some food. Kumasawa wasn't nearly as talented as a professional cook like Goda, but she was far from unskilled. On the contrary, she had been brought up in a fishing village. The simple food she created was sometimes highly praised. Canon arranged the food Kumasawa had finished creating on plates under her direction. Canon also helped in the kitchen sometimes, but since he was rarely placed in that role, he was slightly awkward even though he tried his best. Self-conscious of the fact that he couldn't cleverly arrange the food, Canon's expression darkened slightly, but Kumasawa smiled as though everything was fine.
きれいに盛り付けられてますよ。カノン君もお上手ですよ。
シャノン姉さんだったらもっときれいに。
Canon stopped arranging the food for a bit and hung his head. Canon was one of the people who always assisted Kumasawa in her cooking. Tonight, Canon was doing it instead. As he remembered Shannon's face and her brutal end, he grimaced. Genji spoke kindly to Canon as he advanced a pawn. Nanjo had escaped from the parlour once the mood had grown sour, and Genji had become his opponent in a game of chess under Nanjo's request.
はい、今は忘れます。
それがいいだろう。
Genji purposely refrained from facing Canon as he spoke. He did so because he understood that it might make things tough on Canon if he noticed that someone was looking at his eyes. Nanjo also understood that and held back any thoughtless words.
金蔵さんもどこへ行かれたんでしょうな。ご無事だといいのですが。わかりません。ただ、すべては親方様が望まれ、仕組まれたことのように思っています。それを邪推することは、親方様にお仕えする家具には過ぎたことです。源氏さんは怖くないのですか？私には今夜まだ何か良くないことが起こるような気がして怖いのです。怖いことなど何も。私はただ後宮家にお仕えするだけですので。
Nanjo sighed through his nose and carefully he considered had made a carefully considered move. Nanjo was slightly dubious. Genji could possibly thinking that he'd could Genji possibly thinking that he'd be left out of this? He couldn't even imagine what was happening inside the mansion. But he definitely couldn't deny the possibility that Kinzo had devised something. If you like can be silent the chess, Kinzo had opened the game, and with the result, 6 pieces had been defeated. Could it be that Genji was calm because he believed he alone was on the outside of the chessboard and therefore safe? Nanjo thought about it. Isn't everyone just a piece on this chessboard lined up equally without any exceptions? Wasn't even Genji, who'd gained more of Kanon's trust than anyone, Kinzo's trust than anyone, who was confident in his position as Kinzo's only close friend, just another one of his pieces left out on the chessboard?
源氏さん、私は今夜が本当に怖いのです。無事に明日の朝を迎えられることを心より願っています。
The guest room Eva and Hideyoshi moved into had originally been built to house guests before the guest house's construction. So until a few years ago they had stayed in these rooms even for every family conference and were very familiar with them. This room was just like a room at a hotel, with a bedroom and a bathroom, so even though they were shut in, it was far more comfortable than the parlor.
やっぱり家族だけだとリラックスできるな。他のみんなも客室にこもって鍵をかけてりゃええんや。
夏日姉さんが客間を出るなって威張り散らしてるんだもん。誰も口答えなんてできないでしょ。あの人ずーっと冷や飯を食ってきたから、兄さんが死んでやっと天下が来たって張り切ってんのよ。まったくずうずうしいったら嵐の。
まあそう言うな。夏日さんもあれで結構頑張っとるんやで。お前もそう突っかからんでもええやないか。さっきのレシートの件もあそこまでは言い過ぎやで。
だってあそこで言わなかったらもう言うタイミングがないんだもん。
Eva, sulking cutely and looking at television, sat alongside Hideyoshi, who was lying on the bed.
でも、こうして二人きりになるのはずいぶん久しぶりよね。
そうやな。思えばわしもお前も老けたもんや。ジョージが生まれてから何もかもがあっという間や。
本当にあっという間よ。子供を作るの焦りすぎたかしら。
Eva's eyes looked as like they were staring off into a distance. Yes, she had thought about it as a once-in-a-lifetime chance. Her older brother Kraus had been unable to father a child for quite some time. 6 years passed after his marriage to Natsui without any signs of pregnancy, which didn't please Kinzo at all. Eva herself thought that, since her name would be moved outside of the Ushima register when she got married anyway, it didn't matter whether a successor or the headship was born or not. And then, one day, she had a heavenly revelation. Or maybe it was just the whisperings of the devil that she listened to in her greed. If she could give birth to a successor first, wouldn't she be able to remain in the Ushima register? If things went well, she might have had a chance to inherit the Ushima family herself. When she did propose this to Hideyoshi, he had approved it instantly. This wasn't because Hideyoshi also had greedy thoughts. For Hideyoshi, who had no close relatives, it was a chance for him to feel once more the long-forgotten thing called family. So when they got married, he hadn't fussed over which last name to keep, and quickly agreed to have his name entered into the Ushima register. It hadn't been easy to persuade Kinzo, but as his daughter, Eva knew Kinzo's personality well. Though by choosing the time when Kinzo was most dissatisfied with Natsui, she was magnificently able to make him accept Hideyoshi as an adopted son-in-law. Looking at Hideyoshi, who had achieved success after starting from nothing, Kinzo might have seen a little bit of himself. He quickly grew to like Hideyoshi and approved his transfer into the Ushiyomaya register. George would eventually become the successor to the Ushiyomaya family. Had they raised him strictly with that purpose in mind. He had been worth their while and grown into a fabulous young man who wouldn't disappoint no matter where he went. It was why he had not been permitted to fall in love with a servant like Shannon. So when she learned that Shannon was dead and the engagement was now invalid, though a part of her had still been shocked by the gruesome crime, part of her was also relieved that her dear George wouldn't be stolen by some servant girl.
私、クラウス兄さんのことが昔から嫌いだったわ。偉そうで威張ってて。自分がやがては当主になるのだと自慢してて。だから、それに一矢報いてやりたかった。でも、それは子供の頃の感情なのよ。でもその感情は、結局、自分の人生のほとんどを支配した。それだけならまだいい。その感情は、あなたやジョージまで巻き込んで振り回してしまった。
エヴァ、備え自分を責めるな。
Hideyoshi got up and held Eva's shoulder. She could feel a warm understanding from him.
わしはな、自分の人生はもうとっくに折り返しに入っとる。でもな、今日までの生活を後悔したことは一度もないで。一度もや。エヴァと一緒で他の男どもじゃ味わえん楽しい人生になったと思っとる。戦争で身寄りを失ったわしにもう一度家族のぬくもりを教えてくれた。だから後宮の家には感謝しとるし、わしの唯一の家だと思っとる。わしとお前が歩んできた人生にな、今日までほんまに楽しい人生やったで。
ありがとう、あなた。
Eva hung her head, burying her face in Hideyoshi's chest. Probably no one in the parlor could even imagine this side of Eva existed.
感謝するのはわしや。今日までお前と一緒にいて後悔した日なんてあらへん。
私もよ、あなたと一緒になれてよかった。
ジョージももう立派な大人や。わしが見張ってなくてもしっかり仕事ができる一人前や。で、正月あたりをのんびりモルジブあたりで過ごさんか。わしら二人水いらずや。
いやよ、毎年年賀状の返礼で寝る暇もないとか言ってるじゃない。
次の正月だけはなしや。年賀状はみん黙って下のお年玉くじだけチェックするんや。今年はカラーテレビくらい当てたいで。
やだ、モルジブでお年玉くじのチェックなんてしたくない。
じゃあそいつもなしや。水いらずのんびりで、ジョージが生まれる直前の新婚時代の続きをちょいとしてみんか。
うん、それならいいわね。
モルジブはええとこらしいで。なんもない島に美しいサンゴ礁と水上コテージが並んでてな。
新婚時代の続きっていつからなの？
仕事納めしたらすぐや。旅行店に聞いてみんとわからんが、多分大晦日前には。
いや、今すぐがいい。
Eva nagged at his lips in a peevish yet flirtatious manner. The only sounds that filled the room were the distant voice of the announcer on the news, which Hideyoshi had left on, and the obnoxious pulling of rain against the window. There was a knock on the door and Genji entered.
奥様、お夕食の準備が整いました。お食事はまたこちらでよろしいですか？
ええ、ここへ運ばせなさい。南條先生はまだ厨房にいるのですか？
はい。次の一手を熟考したいとおっしゃっております。ご安心を。他の使用人たちとご一緒です。
源氏さんはじい様の相手ができるくらいチェスが強いもんな。南條先生よりも強いらしいぜ。
そうなんだ。昔相手をしてもらったことがあるけど、あれは勝たせてくれたのかな。
マリア、もうすぐ飯だそうだぜ。しかし、よく一日中テレビを見ていて飽きねえな。
うん。いつもテレビいっぱい見てるから平気。
マリアちゃんはテレビっ子なんだね。
食事だから机の上を片付けないとダメだぜ。
Earlier, we had torn several pages out of Maria's notebook, and there was now a mess where everyone had been drawing together. Jessica began clearing that up quickly. Still, everyone here really can draw. I'd never guessed.
源氏、エヴァさんたちにもせめて食事くらい一緒にしないかとお声をかけなさい。どうせ断るでしょうが。
かしこまりました。
お父様の次はエヴァさんですか。つくづく後宮家の食卓には全員が揃いませんね。
Natsui felt her headache start forming again and lightly held her temples. I'd bet it's hard when half of them are dead. From the distance from the kitchen to the parlour wasn't that great, so Genji had gone and come back by himself, but the guest room was a little further away. Natsui had warned him to avoid being alone whenever possible, and just now Nanjo had also admonished him, saying it'd be better if he had a little more concern for his safety. Kanon accompanied Genji, and the two went to visit Eva and Hideyoshi in the guest room. Don't tell me they're already dead. Genji knocked on the door.
エヴァ様、秀吉様、お夕食の準備が整いました。
He waited for a short while for them to come out, but there was no response.
源氏様、これは。
Canon pointed under the door. A Western envelope had been inserted under it. Normally, when something was inserted this way, it'd be interpreted as a message from someone outside to someone outside someone inside the room. So, since this might be a private note meant for Eva and Hideyoshi, it was not something that Canon and Genji was supposed to take interest in. But this Western envelope was one of Kinzo's, and the same kind as one Maria had taken out last night and surprised everyone with.
間違いない。親方様の封筒だ。
あるいは。
Even though this was one of Kinzo's envelopes, the letter Maria read out last night hadn't come from Kinzo. Genji continued knocking a little harder and called out in a loud voice.
エヴァ様、エヴァ様、源氏でございます。いらっしゃいますか。お返事をお願いいたします。エヴァ様。
But there was no response from inside. Sometimes when the servants called some guests for a meal, the guests would be sleeping so deeply they wouldn't wake up. At times like this, the servants would stick a letter in the door to show that it was time to come out and leave the guest be. Despite that, Genji beat even harder on the door and called out Eva's name. However, there was no answer. Kanon stuck his ear up to the door, held his breath, and listened for any sound coming from inside.
テレビの音らしきものが。でも気配が感じられません。お部屋は空っぽかも。
Genji took out a handkerchief and, carefully not to touch it with his bare hands, gently pulled the envelope that was stuck under the door. It was sealed with a deep red sealing wax. Without a doubt, the mark of that sealing wax had come from the Ushiyamaya family's head of ring.
エヴァ様、エヴァ様、どうかお返事を。もうお部屋にはいらっしゃいませんか。
But there was still no answer. There was the chance that the two were aimlessly walking around the mansion. This was the home Eva had grown up in. There was plenty of reason to think she'd gone out on a casual stroll. Genji groped around in his pocket and pulled a bundle of keys, which contained a key which opened the guest room.
ケンジ様
Canon also understood what this meant. They would sometimes unlock the doors so they can go in and out, like make the beds, but only after they made sure the guests were out. To unlock the door for any further reason, and especially to do so when there's a chance the guest hadn't given permission and might still be in there, was an act on becoming of a servant. But Genji had decided, if the only problem had been that his knock hadn't received a reply, he wouldn't have gone this far. The envelope on the door was doubtlessly one of Kinzo's, or rather one of the western envelopes of the Ushimaya family head. After last night, the sender of this envelope could be someone other than Kinzo. If this letter had been sent by someone else...
申し訳ございません。お部屋を失礼させていただきます。
After giving that final notice, Genji stuck one of the keys in the bundle to the keyhole. There was the sound of the door unlocking, and after slowly turning the knob, he started opening the door. And I have just had an idea. The body swap theory didn't have to be immediately. Light seeped through the crack of the door. Were they in the room? Or had they forgotten to turn out the lights? Wait. It was the sound of a door chain being pulled tight. The chain had been secured. The chain couldn't be secured from the outside, so it proved they were in the room. The sound of voices on the TV seeped out of the room, the lights, the chain, and the TV. All these things made it clear that they were in the room, but there was no sign of them. Genji called to Eva once again through the crack in the door, but there was no answer.
ケンジ様いかがしますか
As part of the job, the servants were able to unlock almost any lock in the mansion. We have no way to open a door with a chain. The only reason to get the chain was to cut it. We're certainly not permitted as part of the servants' usual work. Creepy children really rushed up their backs. Canon held his breath again and tried to sense someone through the door, but even so, he was unable to sense anyone.
私は奥様をお呼びしてくる。カノンはチェーンの切断を。
はい
As Canon hurried away to get a cutting tool, Genji called out to him for him to stop. Take a stop.
待てカノン。厨房に戻り、熊沢と行動するように。断じて一人で行動してはならんぞ。
はいかしこまりました
It looked like Canon was wondering why he had to do something so close in the middle of this urgent situation, but Genji had said it out of wariness. He didn't take care of what happened to himself. But in the worst case scenario, he didn't want anything to happen to Canon. In the kitchen, Kumasawa was piling food onto the serving cart, and Nanjo was waiting for Genji, apparently wanting to show him a move he'd thought up that might turn the tables on him, but Genji's appearance immediately told him that something was wrong.
おや、どうしましたか、源氏さん。南條先生、申し訳ありませんが、この勝負は一度中断させてください。カノンはチェーンを頼む。熊沢、食事の配膳は一時中断し、カノンと同行するよう。私は奥様のところへ行く。南條先生もご一緒に。何かあったんですかな。
Genji took Nanjo, who still didn't know what was going on, and quickly left the kitchen.
熊沢さん申し訳ありませんが僕と一緒に来てください
何があったんですかカノンさん
Kumasawa said almost exactly the same thing as Nanjo, unable to take in the situation, and chased after Canon, who had flown out into the hallway. Taking Kumasawa with him, Canon went to a storage room and looked through the tools and toolboxes hanging on the walls, trying to find something that could be used to cut the chain.
何を探してるんですか私も手伝いますよ
ドアチェーンを切断するんです大きめの番線カッターはどこだっけ
ドアチェーンをどうしてそんなことをするんですか
エヴァ様たちのお部屋にチェーンが中にいらっしゃるはずなのにお声をかけても返事がないんです
It took Kumasawa some time to figure out how cutting the chain and Eva Hideyoshi not answering were connected, but she did realise that this was an urgent situation.
これなら多分
Cannon took down a very large wire cutter that had been hanging on the wall. It was certainly a cutter, but maybe it'd be easier to understand if we shaped it like a large pair of pliers. Cannon remembered once being warned that this dangerous tool could easily cut through one of your fingers. Cannon took that and rushed up the stairs. He already knew this instinctively. He should fight for every minute, every second to open it quickly. Or perhaps he was already...
待ってください、カノンさん。
早く
Kumasawa eventually caught up with him, gasping for breath with both hands and on her knees. When Cannon changed his grip on the wire cutters and looked up at the door, he let out an ah, struck speechless.
なんですかこれは。
Kumasawa screeched weakly, her face pallid. There was no surprise, because right there on the door, just like the magic circle being drawn on shutter of Rose's garden storehouse, there was another eerie shape drawn in a blood-like paint. However, it could be odd to call this one a magic circle, because unlike what most people would expect, it was the circle with shapes drawn inside it, but a slightly more complicated geometric shape. However, those strange characters filling the gaps which weren't from the alphabet were the same kind as the ones of the magic circle on the shutter. But the thing that Cannon struck speechless wasn't how eerie the magic circle was. Something like this hadn't been here a short while ago. First, he had taken a trip back to the kitchen. After that, he'd gone to the storehouse to grab a tool and headed right back. Putting both together, it couldn't have been more than 5 minutes. How could someone like add something this creepy during that period of time? And as though it had just been drawn, almost like the door itself was bleeding, several unsettling vertical lines slowly dripped down, getting longer and longer. Kumasawa's knees gave way and she sank down on the spot. If Kumasawa hadn't done this first, Cannon would surely wanted to.
ベアトリーチェ
ベアトリーチェ様の仕業ですよ。恐ろしや恐ろしや。
Cannon gulped and made ready to a wire cutter and approached the door. He didn't want to get close to this disturbing magic circle, and he really didn't want to touch the steadily dripping substance that would look like blood. But if he didn't get close, he wouldn't be able to cut the chain. Fighting this cold feeling, he gulped again, and after gathering his courage, he went even closer, putting the wire cutter against the door chain. When he pressed forward, the strength managed to cut through the chain far more easily than anticipated. The cut chain fell into 2 separate parts and continued to clang as they swayed back and forth.
カノンさん、足元に封筒が。しかもこれは親方様のもの。
It looked like Kumasawa had also noticed the western envelope at the bottom of the door, and that the sealing wax had been sealed with a head ring. Cannon hesitated for just a second over whether he should be able to open the letter or check inside the room, but eventually decided on filling his original purpose. Cannon pulled a handkerchief out of his pocket. This was so he wouldn't leave fingerprints on the door. If his worst fears realized, the police would want to investigate this room too. He slowly pushed the door open. He was able to more clearly hear the sound of television, which had been sleeping faintly this entire time.
エヴァ様
Eva was lying face up on the bed, with her shoes still on. Kumasawa, who had fearfully entered the room after Cannon and was hiding behind his back, screamed a short eek when she saw Eva like that. Eva's shoes had been the first part of her Cannon scene, so the oddness of wearing shoes on bed was the first thing to strike him. But when Eva's head shifted into his line of sight, Cannon couldn't help but let out a short scream like Kumasawa. Right in the middle of Eva's forehead, something had been placed. Something was growing there. No, right in the center of her forehead was an old-fashioned knife. That or some weapon like it was sticking out. At the base of the knife, it was struck, blood dripped down, staining the sheets on the other side bright red. Kumasawa's knees gave way once more and she sank down on the floor. Her mouth kept flapping open and closed, but she couldn't even scream. But where's Hideyoshi in all this? Eva was dead and some kind of weapon sticking out of her forehead. Check that. Found in the bed forgetting inside the mansion with a weapon resembling an ice pick sticking out of her forehead. Both eyes were wide open and the image of the person who killed her must have been burned into them. But only the mouth capable of naming that person had been shut for all eternity. Her forehead was the last place they wanted to look, they couldn't tear their eyes from it. Right there the weapon had stuck into Eva's forehead, standing almost perfectly upright, and on the handle was a complicated design that you wouldn't expect to see in an ordinary weapon. That thing could be summed up with the word occult. It was a vulgar object with design in that might have been of some demon. Good question. Eva was on top of the bed, but the other was empty. Where was Hideyoshi? After taking a backward glance at Kumasawa, still on her knees and stupefied, he checked the bathroom just in case. The moment to open the door, he was granted by steam and the sound of a shower. The bath was in the familiar style as most hotel bathrooms. When taking a shower, a waterproof curtain was used to keep water from flying out. Waterproof curtain was half open, and lying tumbled down in the bathtub was Hideyoshi, completely naked with both eyes open. And pointing right at Kanon. Just like Eva, a weapon with a demon-like sign was stuck into his forehead. Since his head had been under the shower like a shower with hot water this time, the face wasn't half covered in filthy blood like Eva had been. But the sight of him dead while still taking a shower was tragic enough. Okay, so found in the bathroom, the same guest room Eva was found in. Like Eva, there was a weapon resembling ice pick sticking out her forehead. You can't see either of them by looking through the gap of the door while the chain is set. You can't see them, you can't reach them. Hey, how could a human possibly kill them? Okay, so I was hoping that the faces would be smashed in similar to the ones in the storehouse, because then we could say body swap, ooh. But that seems not to be the case. Just then, they heard Natsui's voice coming from the hall. She was probably coming with Genji.
いえ、まだ読んでおりません。うかつに触らん方がいいですな。犯人の指紋が残ってるかもしれん。警察に渡した方がいい。
わざわざ手紙を残すくらいです。どうせ指紋など残っていません。
As Natsui said that, she picked up the envelope. Before checking its contents, she entered the room where she found Eva, dead.
奥様、こちらには秀吉様も。
これはむごいですな。
カナ、シャワーを止めてあげなさい。気の毒にも程があります。
はい。
Canon gripped his handkerchief and twisted the valve, turning off the shower. In the bathtub, a small jar of body soap had fallen with its cap off. It looked like he'd been attacked while taking a shower. There was a small splash of blood clinging to the white bathtub, and the combination of red and white made horrible contrast.
南條先生。わかった。死斑は出とらんな。死後硬直も始まっとらん。おそらく殺されてから 1時間経ったかどうかというところだろう。しかしこのような柄の短い凶器で頭蓋骨は考えられん。
Nanjo checked their pulse and their pupils, making certain of their deaths once more. As Callan watched this business-like treatment, he thought, couldn't you tell us Lance they were dead without doing all of that? Nanjo thought about moving a weapon, but then he decided it would be better to preserve the scene and hand it to the police, so he left it alone. But on close inspection, the base showed it didn't have a blade. In fact, it was more conical than blade-shaped. He noticed that, rather than a knife, it was more like a short-handled spear, something with a shape better suited for thrusting than slicing. Rather than a short spear, you might call it a thick ice pick. At any rate, after looking at the scene, no further words were needed to describe what sort of terrible purpose such eerily designed weapons were originally made for, nor was it necessary to explain how they carried out their function. Natsui, hoping to escape the repulsive steam filling the bathroom as soon as she could, covered her mouth with a handkerchief and dashed from the room. Just viewing their gruesome bodies for an instant had been enough to burn the image into her eyes. If she looked any longer, that image would surely remain in her vision for all eternity. Rising urge to vomit was exactly the same feeling she'd had the morning at the gardening storehouse. For a while, Natsui couldn't help but stand with her back facing the guest room, fighting that sickness in her stomach.
とにかくこの部屋を子供たちにジョージ君に見せるわけにはいきません。至急この部屋を閉じなさい。
見せられませんとも。両親のこんなむごい姿をとてもジョージさんには。
But they could tell that those fiercely racing footsteps in the hallway belonged to George, even before he came dashing into the room. George and the other children would be waiting in the parlour. However, when they saw Genji speak to Natsui, when they saw her turn pale and fly out the parlour, they felt a sense of foreboding. And when they saw a large group of people gathered around the guest room, they were sure of it.
父さん母さん
なんだよこれ、また魔法陣かよ。
エヴァおばさんたちは無事なんだよな。おいカノン君、これは何の騒ぎなんだ。
バトラ様。
Cameron didn't have to say anything. George's scream after he ran into the room told him everything they needed to know.
誰がこんなことを。殺してやる殺してやる。
ジョージ君しっかり。
Natsui touched George's shoulder with her hand, but he violently shook her off. George fell over beside Eva and buried his face in the bed in front of her mother's face, wailing. Then he pounded on the bed with his fist over and over again.
ジョージ兄さん、しっかり。バトラ様。
Rattler had his back against the wall of the hallway, as he was covering eyes with his right hand and weeping without restraint.
ひでえぜ。心に決めた女を婚約した次の日に失った。同じ日に親父とおふくろまで殺されるなんてよ。そんなのあんまりにもむごいじゃねえか。
Of course, it's sad when anyone dies, no matter who it is, but to Battler, those left alone by the deaths of the others were far more than worthy of pity. Everyone here had lost someone close to them. George wasn't the only one to be pitied. However, George's pain was far greater than anyone else's.
そりゃよ、人はいつか死ぬぜ。人間誰だっていつか 死別の悲しみと戦わなきゃならねえ日が来るだろうよ。でもよ、そいつは兄貴にとってはずっと未来の話で、しかもそいつは一つずつ順番に訪れるべきもんじゃねえかよ。無こすぎるぜ。やろうやろう。少しは人の情けってもんがねえのかよ。
バトラ、泣かない泣かない。
Rhea tried to comfort Battler in a mechanical-sounding voice. Battler violently wiped his tears.
くそ、もう流さねえぜ。悔し涙も悲しみの涙ももう二度と流さねえぜ。全然ダメだ。俺たちは魔女様に爪を食らってるわけだ。主勢一方ってわけだ。そりゃダメだぜ。全然ダメだ。チェス盤がひっくり返っちまうぜ。野郎は俺たち羊が明日まで逃げる手段もなく怯えてるだけだろうと思ってるだろうよ。だからひっくり返すぜ。明日までこの島から逃げられねえのは野郎も同じだ。しょんべんちびりそうになりながら逃げ隠れするのは俺たちじゃねえ。野郎暴いてやるぜ。必ずな。明日までに。いや、明日なんか待たねえ。今夜中にその胸ぐらを掴み上げてやる。
とにかくこの部屋は警察が来るまでこのままにして施錠します。いいですね。
Natsui announced as though she didn't care whether they agreed or not. If anyone had the right to object, it would have been George, but he looked as though he shed enough tears. George nodded slightly, still facing away from the others, and when he stood up, everyone else agreed too. Natsui still hadn't opened that western envelope of a family head that she'd picked up, but now they'd decided to leave the room, she decided to unseat it in the parlour where everyone could watch. As soon as they walked out into the main hallway to head back to the parlour, some of them immediately felt something out of place, or they sensed something strange.
答えよ。
マリアもわかるか。こりゃ何の匂いだよ。ひでえ匂いだぜ。
When everyone sniffed the air, they did notice the horrible burnt smell drifting through the hallways, one that they had smelled until then.
私、ちょっと厨房を見てきます。火はちゃんと消したはずなんですよ。
After noticing the burnt smell, it was natural that Kumasawa, who had been using the burner in the kitchen, suspected that her own slip-up had caused it. Kumasawa hastily dashed away.
カノン、熊沢と行きなさい。一人にさせないように。
はい。
After nodding at Genshi's order, Canon followed after her. He wasn't running, but as he followed her, he tried to search for the cause of the smell in the direction as well.
臭い。
これは確かに鼻が曲がりそうな匂いですね。しかし換気のために窓を開けてもいいものか。
Natsui was reluctant to open the windows in a situation where self-defense was so important.
換気扇を回させましょう。窓を開ける必要はないと思います。
ジョージの兄貴、話しかけても大丈夫かよ。
犯人を探す相談なら構わないよ。
It seems that George has managed to climb out of the abyss of sorrow. All that filled his chest now was a quiet flame of hatred towards the culprit who had stolen the lives of the one he loved and his beloved parents.
部屋にはチェーンがかかってた。さっき構造を見たが、とても外から細工できる代物じゃねえ。つまり
完璧な密室だったってことだ。そうなるね。バラ庭園の倉庫の時は、シャッターの鍵を使用人室からこっそりと持ち出したのだろうとか、あるいは複製の鍵を持っていた可能性とか、いくつか方法が想像できた。でもチェーンは違う。チェーンは一般に浸透した施錠方法の中で最もシンプルに密室を構築できる。
チェーンだけは物理的に破壊しない限り外からはどうにもならないぜ。じゃあつまり犯人は扉からは出入りしなかったってことなのか。
They could have gone in but not out.
こりゃ面白いや。つい数時間ほど前にも扉以外でどうやって部屋から出入りしたのかってみんなで騒いだ気がするぜ。
Back then we were losing our cool, wondering how Grandfather disappeared from his room. The recipient of Aunt Eva stuck it in the door. Receipt Aunt Eva stuck in the door on a whim proved that the door had remained sealed, and since Natsui was the only person to enter or exit during that time, she was under suspicion. Aunt Eva's theory proposed a theory about how Aunt Natsui might have thrown Grandfather out of a window and left by the door herself. But this door is much simpler. It was sealed from the inside by a door chain. The window had also been locked from the inside, and the bodies had been inside the room. This time it really been, without exaggeration, a true closed room. Now we know. So, if we take it as similar last time, if there was no way out, then the culprit had to still be in the room and we just didn't notice him or something. Closet or something. But someone had to be on the outside to make the magic circle. So there's at least, if they were inside, there's a second person outside. That's right. If you include Grandfather's disappearance, the 3 cases have occurred at least 3 times. The door has been a point of interest. The first was the shutter. The key was in the 7th room, so we assume someone knew about the key. This couldn't really be called a closed room. The next was a door was sealed by a receipt. However, Aunt Natsui entered that room, so if Grandfather had left through the window or been thrown out, she wouldn't have been able to lock the door without escaping. But in my theory, Grandfather could have hidden until the receipt was gone and then left the room. Basically, that door can be defeated by a handful of deceptive tricks. But in that sense, you really can't call this a closed room either. And now we have a door sealed with a door chain. Finally, we have to give up. Window, the door, everything had been locked. It was a perfect closed room. The first hadn't been closed room because everyone could be suspected. The second hadn't been closed room because Aunt Natsui could be suspected. But this time, no one could be suspected. It was a perfect closed room because the door chain formed a seal that blocked everyone equally well.
なら、犯人は室内に入らずに犯行に及んだ。部屋の外から何らかの方法で。
確かにチェーンである以上、人が通れるほどは開けなくても多少の隙間を開けることができる。ノックして顔を覗かせたところを襲うとか。いや、甘いか。
甘いよな。エヴァおばさんの遺体が扉のすぐそばだったならそれも考えたぜ。だがエヴァおばさんは部屋の奥のベッドの上。しかも秀吉おじさんはバスルームだった。チェーンの隙間からでは姿を見ることもできねえし、手を伸ばすこともできねえ。ちくしょう、全然ダメだぜ。さっぱりだ。
Something was tugging softly at my sleeve. It was Maria. And she's evil, isn't she? Oh no.
満足？
満足って何がだよ。
バトラは親族の誰かを疑うのが嫌だから、犯人はベアトリーチェであってほしいと願ったよ。だからベアトリーチェは叶えた。バトラが言った通り、絶対に人間には無理なことをして、バトラに魔女の存在を信じさせてくれた。なのにわがまま。
I tapped Maria, who was laughing unpleasantly, on the head with my fist.
ああ、叶えてくれてありがとうよ。今のはその礼と、不謹慎な時に笑ったことへの教育的指導だ。それより教えやがれ。エヴァおばさんたちの部屋の扉にも、また怪しげな落書きがされていた。あれもまた魔法陣なのか。
あれは特に覚えやすい特徴的な形なんだから、あのくらい知っててほしいね。
知らねえから花を持たせてやってんだ。ごちゃごちゃ言わねえで解説しろい。
バトラは暴力的だね。あんまり意地悪すると教えないよ。言うよ、このげんこつ男。あれは月の1の魔法陣だよ。
何の意味がある？その魔法陣のご利益は？書かれてるヘブライ語の意味は？
記されているのは旧約聖書詩編第107編の16節。主は聖堂の扉を破り、鉄の缶抜きを打ち破ってくださいました。魔法陣の効用は2つ。一つはいかなる方法によって閉ざされた扉でも開くことができる。
Okay, that doesn't really mean much because opening the door isn't the problem.
そりゃ便利な魔法だぜ。つまり、魔法の力に頼らなきゃ開けぬ密室の扉っていう魔女様のアピールってわけか。もう一つの効用は、
開かぬ扉を八方塞がりの事態に見立て扉を開く。難解な事態の時に用いることで、それまで思いつきもしなかった解決策を与えてくれるんだよ。
This one's the more difficult one. The problem is, it had to have been written once they'd gotten out of the room, making this entirely meaningless.
平たく言うと、観察力や洞察力、ひらめきや直感を授けてくれるんだね。ベアトリーチェはバトラごとき人間風情に、この扉の開き方がわかるものかって挑発してるんだよ。
よーし、もう黙れご苦労。上等だぜ。その魔女の挑戦、受けてやら。
マリアちゃん、この世に魔女も悪魔も存在しない。父さんと母さんは誰かが殺した。それが僕のよく知る人間なのか知らない人間なのかはわからない。でもそのどちらであっても必ず人間なんだ。
しかしどうやって、せいぜい10センチ程度しか開かない扉の隙間からどうやったら室内の2人を。
それにしても耐え難い匂いです。一体何事なのですか？
Canon and Kumasawa had gone in ahead, realised the smell wasn't coming from the kitchen even before they arrived there. It was because they noticed even bigger waves of stench rising from up the stairs leading to the basement, which they passed on the way to the kitchen.
ボイラー室。
またボイラーの調子が悪いんでしょうか。
Those stairs led to the underground boiler room. The mansion's boiler was old and in poor condition. Both of them had witnessed problems with the boiler on several occasions, so they had never smelled the boiler belching out a stench like this before. Slam.
今の音は。
The thing they heard from the basement definitely was the sound of a door closing. Kumasawa had phrased it as a question, but she already knew it couldn't be anything else. Kumasawa was surprised by the sound, but knees gave way yet again, and she cowered. After all, at that moment, no one could have been in the boiler room. Just a few seconds, everyone had been crowded together around Eva and Hideyoshi's room. So, who had caused the sound of a door closing just now?
Canon-san!
After taking a second to sort out the situation, Canon ran down towards the basement. Since they heard the sound of the door closing just there was no sign of anyone coming up the stairs. The person who closed the door had to be inside the boiler room now. If the boiler room had been a dead end, Canon wouldn't have rushed in so hastily, but Canon was a servant, so he knew. There was two entrances to the boiler room, one that opened to the mansion and one that opened to the courtyard. If you didn't chase them now, they might slip away. Kumasawa reached the same conclusion long before Canon did, but she couldn't let him go alone. If the first thing in the boiler room was culprit, an opponent who had easily killed 6 adults in the first murder, but no matter how Canon confronted them, he wouldn't be a match. Of course, with this argument, even if Kumasawa joined, it wouldn't change anything. At any rate, after a delay, Kumasawa decided that she mustn't let Canon go alone, and she rushed down the stairs. At that time, Canon was already in the boiler room. The boiler room's characteristic damp heat tormented him. It had always been an unpleasantly smelly, hot place. On top of that, the room was filled with a horrible stench, which made Canon feel like he was going to be sick. There was no doubt this room was the source. In that case, Canon had been searching for where the smell was coming from. However, Canon kept gazing straight forward. He grabbed a hatchet from a tool shelf just off the side of the door. He hadn't stretched out his hand because he wanted a hatchet. He wanted to grab a weapon, any weapon. Why? Canon gazed into the darkness where the naked light bulb couldn't pierce, and then he answered.
ルーレットは数字と赤黒にかけて配当を競い合う。だが赤か黒かのようなリスクの低い賭けはその程度の配当しか与えられない。
The words coming from Canon's mouth were swallowed up by the darkness. The darkness suddenly started to swirl, glittering. It was such a fantastical scene. Golden sparkling butterflies that hid in the showers all over the boiler room, flat their wings twinkling beautifully and gathered in the darkness disappearing. Canon continued speaking, directing his words to the darkness that swallowed the butterflies up. But if the butterflies gathered in the darkness, they would certainly laugh. But Canon continued to speak without faltering in the slightest.
逆により的中率の低いかけ方をすればそのリスクに比例した配当が与えられる。親方様は天文学的なリスクを的中できることを奇跡と呼び、その結果得られる天文学的な配当を魔法と呼んでいた。親方様とお前がどんな魔法を求めてルーレットに挑んでいるのか。しかしお前は忘れている。ルーレットには赤でも黒でもない目が出うることを忘れている。
Roulette had a special pocket called Zero, which meant that a house takes everything in a certain variance of the game. This meant that all the coins bet on the table will be swept up, just as though everyone had a forfeit.
僕は一つだけ心に決めていた。もしシャノンが殺されて僕が生き残るようなことがあったなら、この身を投げ出してお前のルーレットを全て台無しにしてやろうと。これは親方様が決めたルールでも、ましてやお前が決めたルールでもない。このルールは僕が作った。僕は もう家具じゃない。お前のルーレットのゼロなんだ。
Cannon's face twisted with humiliation. It was clear that his defiant glance against his own weakness was being ridiculed somehow. Cannon's brow ceased even further, and a face expression that he'd never shown to anyone appeared on his face. The hand gripping the hatchet was shaking. His sweat became drops which slid downward. It was clear that his emotion causing Cannon's hand to shake wasn't just anger. However, Cannon suppressed that emotion.
僕はもうお前の言葉に惑わされたりはしない。悪魔のルーレットはこれでおしまいだ。地獄にてさらに1000年。次の召喚者を待つがいい。ベアドリージュ
Cannon raised his hatch and tried to dive into the darkness. The darkness definitely sneered. It sneered at that courage if it were vulgar, lazy, futile, and meaningless. What? Cannon, his hatchet still held aloft, couldn't take another step after that. The clang, the hatchet that he'd been grasping fell and rolled on the floor. And following that with a pair of thuds, Cannon's knees hit left and right. That hand, which looked like it was trying to catch the sky now but the hatchet had dropped, gradually lowered, landing on his chest. Then the other hand did the same. Right then, the handle of a demon-shaped design was buried in his chest. The same weapon that stabbed into Eva and Hideyoshi's foreheads was in Cannon's chest. Cannon was curled up in anguish, fresh blood dripping down from the corner of his mouth. It was makeup too extreme for Cannon's white skin. Around this scene, the glittering gold butterflies danced through the darkness, mesmerizing. It was a beautiful, beautiful dance, a funeral march of tribute, ridicule, and contempt for a single boy's self-sacrifice. Cannon had already prepared for his own death, but although he could not do nothing but accept the death he received, he attempted one last measure of resistance. He grasped the handle of the weapon sticking out of his chest with both hands, and gritting his teeth with an acute, unearthly pain, he pulled it out. For only a moment, bright red spray gushed out. It made an unpleasant plop sound. It probably resembled the sound of Cannon's soul as it was sucked into the swamp of the dead.
Cannon-san?
Kumasawa screeched at the incomprehensible sight in front of her. Cannon was lying in a pool of blood. Kumasawa's heart was a complete mess. And, what a horrible fate. He wouldn't have been killed if I had been with him. What incredible luck. If I had been there with him, I might have been killed too. As she screeched, her expression was filled with complete confusion, and all of the muscles in her face were pulled up, almost as though she was smiling or crying. But no one could make a fun of expression like this.
何事ですか、熊様。返事をしなさい、熊様。
The first one to dash in was Natsui holding the rifle. Battle and Genji dashed in after her. Normally they probably would have started discussing the origin of a violent stench filling the boiler room, but after they saw Cannon, who was lying on the ground for drowning in an ocean of his own blood, the stench wasn't important anymore.
返事をしなさい。源氏、南條先生をここに。
Natsui realized even though Cannon was on the verge of death, he was still conscious, so she sent Genji to get the doctor. Natsui, holding the rifle off, faced the darkness of the center of the room and shouted.
そこに隠れているものは何者です。おとなしく出てきなさい。そちらから出てこないなら容赦なく撃ちます。
ライトだ。おばさん、 照らすぜ。
Battler, thinking quickly, took out a large flashlight from a tool shelf alongside the door and used its light to cut through the darkness Netsuo was glaring into. But the light only shone on mechanical-looking piping in a door. The door had been left open a small crack, and it was obvious that someone had left through it in a hurry.
夏日おばさん、あの扉はどこへ？
源氏、あの扉はどこに通じているのですか？
中庭です。
逃がすかよ、くそこの野郎。
Battler let out a war cry as he slammed into the door. Cold air from outside suddenly rushed in. There were some thin, rough stairs leading up. Battler ran out them shouting.
待ちなさい、バトラ君。一人では危険です。
Natsui was also rushing up the stairs chasing after Battler. They were in the courtyard. The courtyard of the mansion had been built strictly for lighting purposes, so it wasn't a very elegant place. Because as it was surrounded on all sides, the air was calm and completely undisturbed, even though they could hear the sound of strong winds. There was only a gentle, soulful rain, and as the rain threw the cold and the scattered raindrops dashing up the stairs into the courtyard, Battler looked in every direction. Of course, the odds of finding the suspicious silhouette just standing there nonchalantly were pretty much zero. Battler spun, looking around. He turned again and again. He kept spinning until he almost lost his sense of direction. He prayed that he would see the culprit somewhere in the scenery, but there was no chance. After all he saw as he spun was more and more of the mansion's heartless walls and windows. Furthermore, there were two entrances to the mansion from the courtyard. Neither of them were locked. Because the courtyard couldn't be entered from the outside of the mansion, the doors were built without locks. He didn't know which one they had left through. He had had to give up. Battler pounded the wall with his fist, swearing.
バトラ君、一人で先走ってはダメです。バトラ君。
Battler pressed his forehead against the wall, which he scratched with his fingernails and cried.
畜生。畜生、畜生。平和おばさんに秀吉おじさん、さらにカノン君かよ。6人も殺しやがった。飽き足らずさらに3人も殺しやがった。ふざけるな、ふざけるな。エヴァおばさんも秀吉おじさんも昔からいつも優しくしてくれる愉快なおばさんたちだったじゃねえかよ。
No, she wasn't.
カノン君とは昨日会ったばかりだが、きっとこれから仲良くなれたと思うぜ。なんで殺したんだ。どうして人ってのはな、殺しちまったらな、二度と生き返らねえんだぞ。
One moment, I've got to read something. Gag, head, chest, stomach, knee. Not helpful.
タケノコみてえにひょいひょい生えてきちゃ来ねえんだぞ。どうして殺すんだよ。どうして。
Battler was a boy who could understand the feeling of pain and regret in a person's heart, so he cried, with all his strength. Natsui, who had always thought of Battler as a frank person, was a little surprised to find him in this delicate state, and at the same time she understood how hurt the heart of a young person could be, so she held him.
大丈夫です。あなたも、ジョージ君も、マリアちゃんも、ジェシカも、母として、そして、後宮家の代表として。
Don't tell me they're already dead. Don't. Battler, after sobbing into Natsui's chest for a while, wiped his tears with a bitter smile as though he had been like that the whole time, and tried to appear as though he'd cried more than enough already.
とにかく一度下に戻りましょう。犯人を探すより自分たちの身を守る方が最優先です。明日になれば船が来る。そうすれば警察がやってきて全てを白日のもとにさらし出してくれるでしょう。犯人がどうあがこうともこの島から逃げられるものですか。
そうっすね。警察さえ来れば。
When the seagulls cry, the crime will be solved. But for some reason, Battlers felt a slight sense of uneasiness, as if the seagulls would never cry again. That couldn't be true. When the typhoon passes, surely the live seagulls will return to the harbour again. Don't... No. No, you can't kill off everyone. I returned the boiler room along to Natsui and told, oh, good, they are alive, everyone weakly that we hadn't found anything. We heard that Dr. Nanjo and George had carried Cannon to the servant room. Servant room had a first aid kit and a sink, and could apparently function as a nurse's office. Kumasao and Jessica had accompanied them. Stains of Cannon's blood remained on the floor. Judging by the large amount of blood lost in the ruthless shape of a weapon that had fallen carelessly on the ground, I figured Dr. Nanjo's treatment would probably end in vain. Weapon was doubtlessly the same that me stuck in Aunt Eva and Uncle Hideyoshi's foreheads. But wait, isn't this demonic design on the hand a little different? There seem to be some small differences in this part. Still, as far as the overall shape was concerned, the weapons were all the same type. Although they had seemed brutal, we'd left the weapons stuck in Aunt Eva and her Uncle Hideyoshi to preserve the crime scene. So this was the first time we were able to have a perfect view of the entire weapon. As we had expected, the weapon was not a blade like a knife, but shaped like an ice pick, or rather a thin stake. And it had a spiral pattern, sort of like a drill. It looked like some things that might have been driven into the heart of human sacrifice in some demonic ritual. Including the handle, it was 25 centimeters long. Half of it was the stake-shaped part, which was stained with deep red blood. The length of the blood-stained part made it clear just how deeply it must have penetrated Cannon's chest. Aunt Natsui and Celeste didn't even look at the weapon, and instead stood in front of the incinerator with a horrible stench she was emanated from. Ah, so someone burnt something. Probably a corpse. They must have dragged out that thing which was burning in the furnace. It was smouldering and kept sending up dense waves of an awfully unpleasant smell. Genji Yumiya stared down at it. Aunt Natsui probably couldn't stand to look at it directly. She kept shaking her back to it. I thought nothing could surprise me after everything that's happened. But this... I stood there for a while, moaning with the rising urge to vomit. The true source of that unearthly sense was the scorched corpse we'd been cooking inside the incinerator. The clothes, the surface of the body, the hair were all hideously burnt. That grotesque corpse was in a state where not the face, nor age, nor even the gender could be guessed at. But when I thought of it calmly, I realized that the corpse appearing this time could only be one person. It was grandfather who disappeared this morning, and whose whereabouts had been unknown.
おそらく親方様だと思います。
私も同感です。
I don't think it's 100% Kinzo.
このようなお姿でお亡くなりになるとは。おいたわしや。
でもこの死体本当にじい様だって保証はあるんすか？
The only way to prove that it is Kinzo, or at least not someone else we already know is dead, is to count the corpses.
こうも黒焦げじゃ性別さえも想像つかないってのに。
バトラ君、足をご覧なさい。
Aunt Natsui, with her handkerchief over her mouth and her eyes averted, pointed and told me to look at the corpse's feet.
両足の指が6本あるのがお分かりになりませんか？
Oh.
本当だ。
Just as Genji had said, there were 6 toes on each foot. Each individual toe had looked so small in its line, but it hadn't noticed.
親方様はお生まれの時から両足の指がそれぞれ6本でした。そして故に親方様は後ろ宮家の再興を託されたのです。
後宮家には昔から生まれつき多子症の方が多かったそうです。多分遺伝的なものでしょう。
And does anyone else have it? Polydactyl literally means many fingers. Because of a little mistake by God when a person is born, one of their toes or fingers splits in two and the total number increases. But it isn't usually made. But big deal isn't usually made of polydactyl in the world at large. That's because it isn't a disease, it's something people are born with. So when they are babies and of time they turn 1 year old, they can be taken to hospital and given surgery to make them normal. Even a child with polydactyl can be treated before they become aware, so they might not even remember it themselves. By the way, that means it's possible for it to occur in 1 out of every 2,000 babies, so even though it's usually seen, it isn't rare at all. Speaking of which, I think Uncle Hideyoshi mentioned something to me long ago, something about even Toyotomi Hideyoshi, of a man who unified Japan at the end of the Sengoku period, had 6 fingers on 1 hand. According to Natsui, among the many Shimai family heads, the ones most praised for their wisdom all had polydactyly. Because of that, when grandfather was born, his relatives were all excited at the thought that he might have been another wise leader, and when all the leading relatives died in the Great Kanto earthquake, it was apparently argued that grandfather should be the one to restore the family because of the auspicious sign of his birth. If grandfather hadn't disliked his position as head so much, his 6th toe would have been pretty lucky for him. Come to think of it, I've heard that some country where it's believed people polydactyly should be treated as gods and revered. This is besides the point, but it's fairly common in mythology for a corpse to be burned to hide its identity. But I guess in grandfather's case, just tossing in there wouldn't be enough. And grandfather's body was not simply burnt. It was like Uncle Yoshi, and the thing that we stabbed into Cannon's chest, one of the demon's ice picks and we stuck in his forehead.
指に当主の指輪がありません。
Quickly. Burned in the incinerator with a weapon resembling an ice pick in his forehead, the old sorcerer's wish vanished before it could be granted. He always knew that this one was possibly one possible result of his risky gamble.
昨夜の手紙の通りということですか。お父様、さぞやご無念でしょう。
Natsui let her head drop close and closed her eyes tightly. This storm had also become a vital scene in crime for us to hand over to the police. It was decided that we would leave grandfather's corpse here and lock the room, sealing it. It isn't clear when grandfather's corpse started burning in the incinerator, since according to Genji, the strength of the flames hadn't been as strong, the body must have started burning a long time ago, so the stench could slowly creep out of the furnace and fill the room bit by bit, eventually pouring out and climbing up the staircase. Putting aside whether he was rare or well done, grandfather been brought out, killed and burnt, even though he had started out locked away in a closed room created by his auto-lock. There's probably no doubting this. However, according to Genji, the boiler room is usually locked. Possibility that someone outside our group had snuck in and committed the crime was overwhelmingly high. And there was also a good chance that this person was walking around with something like the master key. After all the doors and windows of the mansion had been checked. Despite that, the culprit was able to strut around the mansion freely. Does this crime confirm that a 19th person exists? There's still that contradiction since they're trying to tout their existence without even showing themselves once. Although with Kiri's chessboard theory, I've been using this contradiction to deny the existence of a 19th person by spinning the chessboard around once more. The very fact that the crime makes it perfectly obvious a 19th person exists means the existence of a 19th person is even less plausible. As long as the 19th person doesn't show themselves in front of us, if the culprit could just get grandfather out through the door sealed by the receipt, if they could just kill Uncle and even Uncle Hitoshi without from the other side of it sealed by a chain, then they could possibly go as far as create a fictional 19th person through strange tricks and devices. If you still want to believe the culprit is among the 18, then the list of suspects has grown very short. The four of us kids are Natsui, Genji, Kumasawa, and Dr. Nanja. One of those people had to be the culprit. Wait, we can't be sure of that. Just a second ago we started doubting whether the corpse was actually grandfather's, right? Maybe we can think of the other bodies in the same way. For example, first of the six had their faces horribly smashed. Some of the bodies had been kept enough for their face to confirm who they were, but that old bastard, for example, lost his entire face as though the whole thing had been neatly peeled off. The only figure we only figured out body which had clothes and surroundings. Did the culprit prepare a fake body beforehand and alter it to make it look like they died, even though they were actually hiding somewhere after committing the crime? It might sound ridiculous, but it's impossible to trick. But wouldn't be impossible to pull the trick off. It's too early to give in to this 19th person. No, this witch.
マリアちゃん、それ以上しげしげと見てはなりません。さあ、バトラ君もカノンの容体も気になりますし、いつまでもこのようなところにはいられません。戻りましょう。
Mari didn't go out with anyone else but remained in the boiler room. The thing she stared at so fixedly probably wasn't grandfather's body, the demon's eyes pick sticking out of his forehead. It's probably the sort of item that an enthusiast couldn't bear to ignore. I tapped on her head.
おい、マリア。ベアトリーチェの目的は何なんだ？俺たち全員の命か。
ベアトリーチェはもうすぐ蘇るんだよ。その時、誰も生き残れはしない。
よくも笑えるもんだぜ。自分だけ蚊帳の外だと思ってるのか？どうして自分の身に危機が迫っていると感じない？どうして怯えない？
ベアトリーチェは約束してくれたもん。マリアは黄金鏡へ連れて行ってもらえるんだよ。そこはね、しがらみも何もないすべての人たちがずっと一緒にいつまでも優しくし合っていける素敵な場所なんだよ。マリアは楽しみだよ。その時はもうすぐだもん。
Just what kind of person is Mario? Only knew that what Mario was like 6 years ago when she was 3. Though that she was once pure and obedient, a good girl. This new Mario 6 years later when Mario I knew didn't seem to fit together. Just who is she, this witch who calls herself Mario? To Mario, who obstinately believes in the witch, the series of unsolvable crimes is proof that the witch actually exists. Every time something occurs that would be difficult for a human, it becomes harder for the rest of us to not believe in Beatrice. It must be an intense pleasure for Maya to see her relatives, who once firmly denied the witch's existence, start acknowledging the witch's existence one by one. That's why she's in high spirits.
マリア、もう一遍だけ聞く。どうせ答えは同じだろうが、もう一遍だけ聞く。お前は昨日バラ庭園で手紙をもらった。そいつは誰なんだ？
だからベアトリーチェ、バトラがまだ信じない。
Maria only repeated what she had already said. Maria, who met the 19th person, the witch, was that really a 19th person, or did one of the 18 just go and say that? All that's certain is that Maria has been with the rest of us constantly, has always had an alibi, and hasn't done anything suspicious. She's simply overjoyed of being Beatrice's messenger, and certainly isn't the 19th person, supposedly. That's right. I wonder what's written in the letter we picked up at Aunt Eva and Uncle Yoshi's room. Aunt Natsui should have still have it with her. The clock's getting way bigger.